In order for Cubase to record and play back audio so that you can hear it, you'll need to make sure that you're configuring it to use your preferred audio interface. So if you already have Cubase running, you can cancel this window for right now, the Steinberg Hub. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then you'll want to go under the Studio menu and select the very last thing in the list, which is Studio Setup. And then you'll see a number of things on the left-hand side of the window and an even larger window on the right-hand side of the window. Go to Audio System right now and look at what is set next to the ASIO driver. ASIO is an acronym for Audio Streaming Input Output. And it's the driver that talks to your audio interface. And chances are you have a professional audio interface that is connected to your computer either through USB or USB-C or Thunderbolt or even FireWire if you have an older computer. But as long as you've made that connection to the audio interface on your computer, then you can choose its ASIO driver. Presumably you have either installed the drivers that came with the professional audio interface or that you have downloaded and made sure are the most up-to-date drivers from the manufacturer's website. In my particular case, I'm using a Steinberg-branded audio interface called a UR28M, but you may have a variety of different audio interfaces connected to your computer. For example, everyone has the built-in audio, which is just the sound chip that's inside of your computer, but that's usually not a very good one. They don't sound very good, and they don't offer a very wide array of different types of audio connections, either for input or for output. So in my particular case, I'm going to make sure that I have chosen the Steinberg UR28M, and if I'm switching, I'll have to hit the switch button. And let's look at a couple of other things here. Let's look at the input and output latency. This is how long it takes for the audio to be received and then spit back out of the computer. So there's 8.5 milliseconds roughly for the input latency, and a little bit more than 8.5 milliseconds of output latency. That gives us about 17 milliseconds of round trip. And if I wanted Cubase to feel more responsive, I'll need to alter the buffer size. And that latency is what you will hear when you are playing virtual instruments or if you're monitoring your audio through the software. And we'll get more into that a little bit later. But for right now, let's make this more responsive. So let's go to whatever appears underneath the audio system. You can see in my case, it's the Steinberg interface. So I'll click on that, and then I'll click on the Control Panel button. That will take me to a window that will look different depending on what kind of audio interface you're using. Sometimes it will take you to a proprietary window that will have the buffer settings listed somewhere on the window. In this particular case, I just got a very simple window where I can choose the buffer size. And I'm going to go with 128 samples, then hit close. And now you'll notice that the input and output latency has been cut almost in half. So now I get a much more responsive system. I don't feel that lag behind with a high amount of latency. But you may need to increase the latency later on when you are adding more and more audio tracks and more instrument tracks and effects and so forth. And there's one other thing here that I would recommend checking. Let's go back to the audio system window, and you'll notice that I have my advanced options tab open. So you can get that just by clicking that little chevron. And I'm going to make sure that my processing precision is set to 64-bit float. By default, it's 32-bit. But I like having fewer rounding errors in the summing of all of the audio tracks that Cubase will be mixing. And that's what 64-bit floating point is for. So make sure that that's selected. And since almost everyone now has a multi-core or multi-CPU computer, make sure that you have Activate Multiprocessing turned on, as well as ASIO Guard. It's good to get started with the normal setting. If you're using a really bleeding edge computer that has a lot of cores and really high speed ratings, is like 3 or 4 gigahertz or even higher, then you may want to choose a high level. But for right now, let's just set it on normal. And that will get your audio interface talking to Cubase properly. And next, let's talk about configuring the MIDI interface.